Hey everyone, today we're diving into one of the most intense moments in medieval English history, the Battle of Stamford Bridge. This was a clash that took place on September 25, 1066, in Yorkshire, England, and trust me, it's not just your average medieval battle. We're talking about a showdown between King Harold II of England and an invading army led by Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway. Now, here's where it gets juicy. Just days before this, on September 20th, Hardrada, along with Harold's own brother Tostig, actually won a battle against two English earls at Fulford Gate. They probably thought they had the upper hand, but little did they know, Harold too wasn't messing around. He led his army north to get his revenge, and at Stamford Bridge, both Hardrada and Tostig were killed. Harold might have won this battle, but fate wasn't exactly on his side for long. Why? Because only a few weeks later, on October 14th, another invasion hit, and this time it was William, Duke of Normandy. That's right, the infamous Battle of Hastings, where Harold was killed, and the Normans ended up taking over England. Let's rewind a bit to understand how we even got here. After the death of King Edward the Confessor in January 1066, Harold Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex, became king. And here's the catch. King Edward died without an heir, so the crown was up for grabs. Harold took the throne, but how he did it is still up for debate. There are whispers that Edward personally named Harold as his successor on his deathbed, but there were plenty of others who thought differently. Harold was no stranger to battle either. He'd already made a name for himself during his campaigns in Wales between 1063 and 1064. But if we go back to 1064, there's this murky story where Harold supposedly visited William, Duke of Normandy. Why, you ask? Some believe Edward sent Harold on a mission to let William know he'd be the next king of England. William certainly believed that Edward had promised him the throne way back in 1051. But others say Harold never even went to Normandy. Or, if he did, he wasn't there to hand over any crown. He was blown off course and ended up in France by accident. Either way, William didn't let him leave empty-handed. Some stories say William only let Harold go after he promised to support William's claim to the English throne. Whatever really went down, one thing's for sure, by August 1066, William was gearing up for an invasion of England to claim what he believed was his, and Harold knew it was coming. But before he could focus on William, there was another problem, the Norwegian king, Harald Hardrada. Now, Hardrada's decision to invade England right around the same time as William is what many people believe ultimately sealed the fate of the Anglo-Saxons. Hardrada wasn't just some random Viking king. He had years of military experience, fighting as a mercenary for the Kievan Rus and even in the elite Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Empire. This guy was no joke. But he wasn't alone in his quest for the English throne. He had an unlikely ally, Tostig, Harold's brother. Tostig and Harold had some serious beef. After being kicked out of Northumbria in 1065 because of his harsh rule, Tostig wanted revenge. And who better to team up with than Hardrada? Hardrada's claim to the English throne was shaky at best, but that didn't stop him. He put together a fleet, possibly around 300 ships, some say as many as 500, and set sail from Norway. After a few pit stops, he landed in England on September 8, 1066. Tostig, with his own fleet, joined him, and together they began pillaging the English coast before making their way inland. So, that's how the pieces were set for one of the most crucial battles in English history. Two invaders, both with their sights set on the crown, and Harold stuck in the middle, defending his kingdom from all sides. So, just before Harold's epic victory at Stamford Bridge, there was another critical battle, the Battle of Fulford Gate, which took place on September 20th, 1066. Here's the setup. Two young English earls, Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria, rallied their forces to face the invading Norwegian army led by Harald Hardrada and Harold's own brother Tostig. The exact details of this battle are a bit fuzzy because, unfortunately, the contemporary records didn't capture it. But it's mentioned in some Scandinavian sagas that came centuries later. Sagas that, let's be real, are more like a mix of fact and Viking fantasy. Now, at Fulford Gate, both sides were armed with the typical medieval weaponry: swords, axes, spears, and shields. The frontline fighters probably had chainmail, helmets, and those distinctive round or kite-shaped shields. There was also a good amount of missile-throwing action going on: javelins, arrows, even slingshots. But the real action started when both sides formed their shield walls, with warriors packed tightly together, shields raised. Once that initial formation broke, the battle descended into chaos, small groups fighting in messy, brutal combat. While it's not entirely clear how the battle went down, what we do know is this: Hardrada and Tostig won, decisively. Edwin and Morcar, inexperienced and outmatched, managed to escape with their lives, but a huge chunk of the Anglo-Saxon army wasn't so lucky. Many who weren't cut down drowned while trying to retreat across the River Ouse. It was a disaster for the English, and Hardrada's forces went on to capture York just days later, on September 24th. Meanwhile, Harold, still down in London, gets word of the Norwegian invasion. He wasted no time, gathering his army, including up to 3,000 elite housecarls, his professional, heavily armored troops, and marched north as fast as humanly possible. We're talking about a forced march of around 40 kilometers a day, and by the time he reached Tadcaster, just outside York, it was already late on September 24th. But here's the thing: Harold wasn't about to give his enemies any breathing room. By the next day, September 25th, Harold and his army caught Hardrada and Tostig completely off guard at Stamford Bridge. The invaders were totally unprepared for a fight. In fact, they thought they were just meeting some local leaders to negotiate hostages and seal York's surrender. To make matters worse for them, they had even left their chainmail armor behind at their camp after celebrating their earlier victory at Fulford. Big mistake. The battle took place on a flat field near the River Derwent, with the Stamford Bridge providing the only way across. And according to the stories, a lone Scandinavian warrior heroically held the bridge against the English for as long as he could, a tale that's probably more myth than reality, but it does add to the drama. The surprise was complete, and Hardrada's men were thrown into disarray. Without their armor, disorganized and caught off guard, they didn't stand much of a chance. The fighting was fierce but brief, and both Hardrada and Tostig were killed during the battle. The once mighty Viking invasion was reduced to a handful of survivors, just enough to fill 24 ships, compared to the hundreds that had set out. These survivors, led by Hardrada's son Olaf, sailed back to Norway in defeat. One particularly brutal description from a 13th century source claims that the rivers were so clogged with the bodies of dead Vikings that the ocean itself was stained red with their blood. Tostig, despite his betrayal of his brother, was buried honorably in York, while the rest of the dead, well, they were left where they fell, their bones said to still be visible in the fields 50 years later. You'd think after such a massive victory, Harold might have had a moment to catch his breath, but nope. Just 3 days later, on September 28, 1066, William of Normandy landed on the southern coast of England with his invasion force. The Normans had been waiting for the right moment, and with Harold up in the north dealing with Hardrada, William couldn't have timed it better. What William didn't know, however, was who had won the battle in the north. Would it be Hardrada or Harold coming to meet him in the south? As soon as Harold got word of William's landing, he gathered his battered, exhausted army and marched them all the way back down to face the new invaders. That's right, 2 forced marches in less than a week. Talk about brutal conditions. By the time Harold reached Hastings, his men were tired, probably demoralized, and now faced a fresh Norman army ready for battle. On October 14, 1066, Harold and his army faced off against William at the Battle of Hastings. And here's where it all unraveled. The Normans had cavalry, something the Anglo-Saxons weren't prepared for, and Harold's forces were already worn out from the marches in recent battles. The fight was brutal, but by the end of the day, Harold was dead, killed in battle, and his brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, had also fallen. It was a crushing defeat. William the Conqueror, as he became known, had won. By Christmas Day of that same year, William was crowned King of England, marking the end of Anglo-Saxon rule after 500 years. But William's real fight wasn't over. It took him another 5 years of battling rebels and securing his control over England, including building castles all over the country, before he fully solidified his reign.